Now that the project manager has the authority on the project, it is really important to identify who are all the important people on the project. Those people or groups of people who have a vested interest in the project are called stakeholders. And it is through the next process during the initiating phase that we will identify those people through a process called Identify Stakeholders. Note that this process is not the one to identify and assign project team members or resources who will perform the project work on a day-to-day basis. This process, rather, is to identify those people who have influence on the project, either positively or negatively, based on their priorities and interests. Identifying these people may seem to be easy, but knowing their motivations, interests, and personal inclinations in the context of the project outcomes may be tricky, to say the least. Some key stakeholders are called project sponsors, and some are customers. A sponsor is an executive in the organization with the authority to assign resources and enforce decisions regarding the project. In the event of a conflict or a stalemate in the project related to some kind of decision making, it is this person who makes the final call. A customer is usually the person who intends to use the deliverables, product, or service from the project, and usually they are the same as the sponsors of the project. Functional managers may be important stakeholders on the project too, and in a matrix environment, they are the one who own the resources. The project manager may be constantly negotiating for resources with these functional managers, and hence it is important to identify them upfront. It is important to note that the functional managers may not have a direct interest in the outcome of the project, and hence may not be that much interested in it. The project manager is a person who assumes total responsibility on the project, either it is successfully delivered or not. The project charter identifies and authorizes the project manager as a key stakeholder. It is the responsibility of the project manager to take up upon himself or herself to lay the ground rules for the team, any standards or methodologies that will be followed, and all the necessary policies that will govern the project. It is the project manager who establishes all communication channels with various stakeholders identified for the benefit of the project and with one key goal in mind, that is, to successfully deliver the project in its defined performance parameters. And with so many stakeholders on the project and each having their own influence and impact, it is important to have a register to keep track of people and their changing priorities. This process of identifying stakeholders takes you through the process of creating a stakeholder register using the inputs we so far have on the project, that is, the business case and the project charter. This process is found in the stakeholder management knowledge area. The tools and techniques used here are 3 in number. Expert judgment through meetings are used to identify people. Stakeholder analysis is used to understand their specific needs and expectations. And it's also important to know why certain stakeholders have certain expectations and what will it take to satisfy them through the means of the project. As a project manager, you will also have to probe into these people to know what ticks them to keep them motivated on the project and what are their thresholds beyond which you will lose their support on the project. The stakeholder register should be your guiding document that may need to be constantly updated to keep track of changing priorities of people. This is how a typical stakeholder register looks like, and it is usually a spreadsheet document wherein you fill in details about the various stakeholders, their position and role in the organization, and more importantly, their expectations in terms of what do they envision getting out of this project, for which they are either an important sponsor or an important supporter of the project itself. You will also capture their influence on the project in terms of how much can they steer the project towards a successful completion or a complete failure with the loss of their support. You will also probe on their interest on the project and how does it affect their bottom line and their impact on the project as well. Lastly, you will also capture their overall importance based on the previous fields collected. Let's fill in the stakeholder register for our example project for the pyramids. The project name is obviously the pyramid project. Their date, which is some date in 2060 BC. In here, we will start listing all the important stakeholders, starting with the most important stakeholder, who is Khufu, the pharaoh. Since the role of the pharaoh is the primary sponsor on the project, who is the person who controls the budgetary aspects of the project. In the expectations, we mention what are the primary expectations of this stakeholder, which in this case is the pharaoh is absolutely not interested in any form of delays, since it has to do with the uncertainty as to how long he's going to live. And for that reason, he doesn't care much about how much money is going to be spent in building the pyramids, even if it takes a fortune to build it. In the influence is obviously very high influence, and since he's very much interested in the outcome of this project, his interest is going to be very high. The impact on the project outcome are also very high, and his overall importance to the project very high. Let's say the next important stakeholder is the head priest, who is responsible for the overall architecture of the pyramids in terms of it meeting the religious or astrological beliefs. His role on the project could be in the capacity of a design lead, and his expectations are that the pyramids should meet all the necessary astrological requirements that will ensure that the remains of the pharaoh will ascend to the heaven according to their beliefs. The influence of this person is again very high. His interests could be something like high. Impact on the project could be very high, and his overall importance could be very high as well. As you see here, we are completely making up stuff to fill this stakeholder register. Let's say the next stakeholder is by the name Mech, who is a commander in the army, and he's responsible for managing all the workers and laborers who will be working hard on the pyramid. This guy will be responsible for the 20,000 plus workers who will be working under his command, and hence his main concern is if they will be fully utilized on the project. His influence could be something like high, interests are high, and the impact could be high, and the importance also could be high. This, as you see, could be extended to cover all the other important stakeholders on the project with their appropriate expectations, influences, interests, impact, and importance on the project, captured in this one document. Now we have the project stakeholder register as well ready in the initiating phase. With the stakeholder register ready, you now know who are all the important people who will shape various decisions on the project. With the two project documents ready, we are now concluding with the initiating phase and moving into the planning phase. We have now completed the initiating process group and all the processes within it. So here we are at the beginning of the planning phase. At this point, we now know why are we doing this project and who are all the important people on it. Armed with the project charter, which puts you, the PM, now in the driving seat, and with the buy-in of all the important stakeholders, you can now begin the planning phase of the project. And we will now take one of the first steps in planning. Planning entails walking through the project and getting it organized well before the actual work on the project begins. Project planning ensures that the goals as stated in the project charter can be truly achieved within the defined constraints of time and budget. This can only be achieved with the other dimension of the project called the scope is clearly defined and tightly controlled all throughout the project. Hence, the first area we need to look into at the start of the planning phase is to know exactly what is going to be done on the project. And this is determined in the scope management knowledge area. As you see here, the scope management knowledge area lies in the planning phase of the process groups. And within this dot represented here, there are multiple processes that we will look into shortly. Scope on a project means the product, service, or result that you will deliver. And secondly, all the work that you will do on the project to get to that product, service, or result. Note that there are two portions to the scope of the project. First talks about the product or service itself, its functionalities and specifications that shape the product or service. And the second is all the work that is needed to be done to build that product. Hence, the scope of the project is broken down into the product scope and the project scope. In the example of the pyramids project, the structural specifications of the pyramid in terms of how tall or big you want the structure to be and what stone to use and how much slope you want on the outside, etc., are part of the product scope. As you may realize, Just having the product scope is not enough to get the pyramid constructed. A lot of other work also needs to be done to get the structure built, like ordering the stone blocks from some place far off, having them cut into proper sizes and shapes that make up the pyramid, and transporting all of those big blocks of stone to the site. In addition to that, all the planning and coordination that takes place to pull together all these things comes under the project scope. Determining the scope of the project is relatively easier. It is simply known by asking the question, what are the things that need to be there at the end of the project that meets the goals and objectives defined earlier as part of the product scope, and also what are the things that need to be done in terms of the activities to get to that product. And these are defined under the project scope. One of the most important output from the scope management knowledge area is the work breakdown structure, or WBS. In fact, it is so important that every other subsequent planning step, like scheduling and budgeting, are dependent on this one output. The WBS is the last deliverable that comes out of this knowledge area in the planning phase, but to get to that, we will have to go through 3 preceding processes that takes you to the WBS. The 3 processes that will result into the WBS are collect requirements, define scope, and create WBS. As you see here, to get to the WBS, we will take the inputs we have so far, which are the project charter and the stakeholder register. These will be fed into the 3 processes that we will discuss shortly, and at the end of it, we will get the work breakdown structure, the details of which we will discuss in the last process that creates it. Collect requirements is the first process in the scope management knowledge area, and that is what we will discuss now. As a first step, it is important to collect requirements that shape up the scope of the project. But first, let's discuss what are requirements. Requirements are the characteristics of the individual component of the product or the service that becomes the scope of the project. They are the functionalities of those components and also the product as a whole. And these functionalities are from the perspective of the end user or customer who will ultimately be using the product or the services. It is therefore important to collect requirements according to the needs and expectations of the customers and end users. At this point, you know what the high-level requirements are from the project charter and the business case, and you also have identified the relevant people from the stakeholder register. You use these inputs and start using the various tools and techniques to create the output. The tools and techniques that will be used here are various workshops and interviews that you will have with various stakeholders to collect and gather the necessary requirements, and those will be documented in the requirements documentation, which is one of the output from this process. The aim here is to collect as many requirements as possible from the stakeholders to be able to satisfy their expectations and needs when the final product or service is delivered. It is also important to trace back where the individual requirements came from, which is captured in the requirements traceability matrix. The next sub-process is to create what is called the project scope statement. This is one document that serves the purpose of capturing exactly what is in the scope of the project. This is the project scope statement. In addition to what is in the project scope, it also contains what is not in the scope of the project. It also describes what are the terms of acceptance of the final delivered product, called the acceptance criteria, and also contains certain assumptions that are made on the project. As we will see in the next lecture, there is a visual tool that will capture all that is in the scope statement, and that is, as you may have guessed, is the WBS, or the work breakdown structure. The statement of work is sometimes closely linked to the project scope statement, serving the same purpose to determine exactly what is and what is not part of the scope of the project. The project scope statement is created using the tools and techniques of workshops and data analysis. The purpose of the project scope statement is to document exactly what is going to be delivered as part of the project, nothing more and nothing less. And it serves as an agreement between the project team and the customer that states precisely what the work on the project will produce. The product or service you're trying to build or implement is the sum of its individual components or parts. It is always easier to plan and control smaller portions of a large scope of work, and by dividing the scope into smaller chunks, the entire project becomes manageable. The technique used to divide large project scopes into smaller portions is called decomposition. Decomposition is a technique to divide the project scope into manageable components of work. And the biggest benefit you get by decomposing a larger scope is that it helps to accurately estimate the costs, resources, and timelines for the entire project itself. The work breakdown structure is defined as a deliverable-oriented hierarchical decomposition of the work to be executed by the project team to accomplish all project objectives. In other words, it is the branched-out version of answering the question, what all do we need to get the project done? It's the WBS that will clearly define the 100% scope of the project, and as an extension, what is not part of the scope of the project. Hence, what you do not see on the WBS will not be delivered as part of this project. As shown here, to get a bicycle done, you need the wheels, the frame, and other components. The wheels may be further reduced to its individual components, like the tube, the wheel frame, and the spokes, etc. This process of breaking down into smaller components is called decomposition. This becomes a primary technique in obtaining the WBS from the inputs we have so far. In this WBS for the bicycle, having an engine to power the bike is not part of the scope of the project, since it is certainly not listed in the WBS. The last level at which the decomposition stops is at the work package. There are smaller, manageable pieces of work that can be accurately estimated for their duration of work and cost that we will see in the next knowledge areas. Often each WBS block of work is named with numbers and follows specific rules of numbering. This is stored in what is called the WBS dictionary that also contains additional information about the description of work, references to that work like contractual agreements, etc. As you see here, using the decomposition technique for breaking down the project for pyramid, the next level that you can break down is into these three levels belonging to the work on the exterior portion of the pyramid, the work on the interior, and then the surroundings to the pyramid. And those can then be broken down into another level that corresponds to more manageable pieces of work. And as you see here, for the exterior portion, this breaks down into all the work that corresponds to putting the blocks of stone in place and the mortar that may be needed to keep the blocks together. For the interior portion, this can be the work related to constructing the chamber and the passages. And the work that corresponds to the surrounding areas of the pyramid can be broken down into the effort to build the roads and the gardens around it. The last level shown here in the WBS are the work packages that are the smaller components of work that are more manageable and hence can be accurately estimated for their cost, resources, and the timelines. Very often on projects, you are faced with requests to add new scope or elements to the scope that may sometimes look no big deal to add. This may come from people on your team or sometimes straight from the top senior management or the sponsor of the project. To add or not to add this kind of scope that is requested during the project will be a decision to make by you as a project manager. Here's where the scope baseline comes to your rescue. As soon as you obtain the documents from the three processes that we discussed so far, you need to perform an important step as a project manager. You see, projects are always on the move, but there are some moments at which point in time you have to force things to literally freeze and stop. This is one moment when you need to freeze upon the scope and all the activity that is going on within it and capture within the scope baseline and probably set this in stone. The scope baseline is the collective sum of all the documents we got from the previous three processes in the scope management knowledge area. These documents, as we saw, were the requirements documentation, the requirements traceability matrix, the project scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and what is not shown here, including the WBS dictionary. All these documents constitute the scope baseline. The scope baseline becomes the initial agreed upon scope between all the parties involved, and it is used as a benchmark to refer back to during later phases of the project to to compare to and see the variations from it. Let's now try to understand two additional concepts that are related to the scope on the project, and those which are a source of